Hi, it's Alissa from Maintaining Motherhood, and today I want to show you the easiest bread recipe that I've ever used. It turns out great every time. As I do this bread recipe, I want to kind of take you through step by step how to make bread in general so that you can apply these principles to any bread recipe that you have. So let's get started. I really love this bread recipe. It's easy because it has ingredients that I always have at home. There's no honey in it or soy lecithin or other kinds of ingredients that may be hard to find at the grocery store. No emulsifiers or dough enhancers. It's just flour, sugar, salt, water, yeast, and some oil. One thing that I want to do in this video is I want to show you how to make the bread both in a mixer and then if you don't have a mixer. I wanted to show you what it would look like if you kneaded it by hand and kind of how to make bread intuitively and not just follow the recipe. The first thing you're gonna do is you want to take 2 cups of water. The water temperature that you use in the bread recipe is going to be almost hot. It's gonna be about like bottle temperature warm, is what I would say. And so you're gonna put in a measuring cup, you'll put the water and the yeast and then something for the yeast to feed on, so the sugar. And you're gonna let that proof or just kind of sit and ferment for about 5 minutes. While I'm letting the yeast proof in the mixer or in my bowl, I'm going to go ahead and I'll add 3 cups of flour and the oil and the salt. Now with the oil, I've used olive oil, I've used vegetable oil. I've even used applesauce and it always turns out no matter what kind of oil I use. So when your yeast is done proofing, it should look like this, kind of bubbly and foamy. That's how you know if your yeast is good. If it doesn't bubble or foam, your yeast is probably old and you might want to get new yeast before you make your bread. When the yeast is done proofing, you're going to go ahead and add it to the 3 cups of flour, the oil and the salt, and you're going to start mixing it. I usually mix mine on the 2nd notch, so I guess speed 2 on my mixer. You don't want it so high that it's gonna be spitting the flour out, but you also don't want it so low that it's barely kneading the dough. And you're going to be kneading it for 7 minutes. So during that 7 minutes, you're going to be gradually adding in the flour until it gets to be not a sticky consistency. So you'll add in a cup at a time, just kind of barely shake it in and let it fully mix it in. So this is too sticky. I usually tell my kids to listen to this sound. Kind of a pat, pat, pat sound. And that's how I know when it's the right consistency for the dough. And this is what it will look like when it's the perfect consistency. You're going to be able to touch it, but it's not going to stick to your hands. The dough should come off fairly easily from your fingers. After you've kneaded the dough for 7 minutes, you're going to go ahead and just cover that bowl and set it aside for 30 minutes so that it can rise. While I let the mixer bread rise, I'm going to go ahead and make my 2nd batch, just kneading it by hand. In a measuring cup, you'll put the water and the yeast and the sugar, and you're gonna let that proof or just kind of sit and ferment for about 5 minutes. While I'm letting the yeast proof in my bowl, I'm going to go ahead and I'll add 3 cups of flour and the oil and the salt. When your yeast is done proofing, it should look like this, kind of bubbly and foamy. When the yeast is done proofing, you're going to go ahead and add it to the 3 cups of flour, the oil and the salt, and you're gonna start mixing it. And you're going to be kneading it for 7 minutes. So during that 7 minutes, you're going to be gradually adding in the flour until it gets to be not sticky consistency. So you'll see as I knead by hand, I kind of push it forward and fold it over, turn it around, and just keep repeating that. As it gets sticky, I can feel when it's kind of sticking to the palms of my hands. That's when I add a little bit more flour and keep kneading the dough. Again, I knead it for 7 minutes, and I keep making sure that I add flour a little bit at a time until it's no longer sticking to my hands. And you can see here's the perfect consistency for it. So I'm gonna go ahead and cover that and set it aside. I grease my pans liberally, and I just use Crisco, or you can use the spray pan. It doesn't really matter. You could probably even grease it with butter and it would be delicious. I've left my bread to rise for about 30 minutes. Now the recipe says that you can punch it down. I'm going to be mixing it up a lot with my hands, so you can see my finger can push the dough down so you can tell it's risen. And I'm gonna take that, I'm gonna split it in half. And then I just kind of like roll it up, kind of like a jelly roll. On one side, flip it, roll it up again, and then as I put it in my greased pans, then I just pat it down. And I don't really know anybody else who does this, but I've had way too many loaves of bread with a big hole in it, and then nobody will eat those pieces, or the peanut butter and jelly just runs through it. So I just make sure to smash it down in the pan. Then the heel is a good sized piece of bread as well, instead of it just being a tiny little nubbin. So that's why I do it that way. It's going to rise until it's double in size, so between 45 and 60 minutes. I'll set it someplace warm, and at this point I'll usually turn on the oven and have it be preheating so that those can rise in a really nice warm spot. Once the bread has risen for that 45 to 60 minutes, I'm gonna go ahead and cook it in the oven for 25 to 30 minutes. It'll be golden brown on the top. If it's not a golden brown color, it's probably not done yet, and you might want to put it back in the oven for a little bit longer. You'll want to take it out of the pans after you take it out of the oven, otherwise it will sweat and kind of turn soggy. So I take it out of the pans and I put it on a metal cooling rack. You can even brush the tops with butter if you want, or you can just skip that step.
Are you taking that bread?
I'm taking a picture with my bread. And here you can see the bread. It's beautiful, no bubbles in it, but it's like a nice light consistency.
Can I have that?
I think the easiest way to cut the bread is if you kind of let it sit out and completely cool so that the middle doesn't kind of mush down as you cut it. Sometimes I'll even just I'll let it cool for a couple hours. I'll put it in a bread bag overnight and I'll cut it in the morning so it makes really nice, easy slices if we can wait that long to eat it. That's my favorite recipe to use to make bread. It's super easy. I've used all kinds of flour. I've used whole wheat. I've used white flour. Today I just used white flour. My favorite is probably to use half and half, like a whole wheat, fresh ground, and a white flour. I do notice that when I use fresh ground flour, I tend to use a little bit more flour than I normally would with a store-bought kind of a flour. This recipe calls for 6 to 7 cups of flour, but it was interesting because as I made the recipe this time, the bread that I made in the mixer, it only took 5 cups, and the bread that I kneaded by hand, it took about 5.5 cups of flour. I've made this recipe so many times, and it's always a little bit different, so you just have to be like paying attention to your dough. So I hope you like this recipe. Try it out. Let me know how you like it. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments below. Make sure to like this video and subscribe, and we'll be baking again soon. Thanks.